The border agent that sat behind a thick panel of tempered glass, dressed in a moderate black suit, furrowed his brow at his screen for a couple of seconds, while she pressed her hand against the biometric scanner attached on the outside of his little cabin. There was a clear hint of recognition in his eyes, especially now that her personal data was most likely appearing on his terminal. It was probably worth assuming that he had seen, or at least heard about her in the news at some point. She just hoped this wouldn't spell any trouble for her. The contemplative look on the official's face certainly didn't invite much confidence. However, after a few more seconds, his contemplative scowl morphed into a pleasant customer servicey smile as he turned his eyes onto her again. "Thank you, ma'am," he announced pleasantly, and Sheeta took this as a sign to remove her hand from the console. With a wave of his hand, the agent then indicated for her to move along, seemingly dismissing her from his inspection. "Welcome to Earth," he added cheerfully, as she finally walked away from the border control area and into the large open space waiting behind it.
"See? Nothing to be worried about,"
Coco happily cheered with her arms raised. The commander had waited some paces behind the crossing, so Sheeta wouldn't lose the group in the crowded spaceport, while Nia and Tuya had moved on somewhat into a designated waiting area. Sheeta huffed and shook her head. "It's not my first time going through customs," she announced, and crossed her arms in a dignified manner, trying to dismiss Coco's antics before they could even begin. However, it seemed there was no stopping the commander once she got going, and Coco teasingly poked against Sheeta's shoulder with her finger while walking alongside her. The pokes were harshly muffled by the multiple thick layers of clothing covering Sheeta's skin at this point, but could still be clearly felt, meaning there was probably some serious strength behind them.
"Well, you still look pretty worried there when Jamie got pulled out of the line earlier,"
the human chuckled, and Sheeta couldn't quite keep a brief, worried grimace from shooting across her face at the statement, as she quickly glanced back in the direction some of the orderlies had led James towards a few minutes earlier, while they had been queuing up for their arrival to be processed, along with all the other travellers arriving from far-off places. Honestly, who wouldn't be worried if their boyfriend got suddenly taken aside to a separate room during border control? "He's going to be fine, right?" Sheeta asked, deciding to ignore the fact that Coco was still looking to tease her while looking for some reassurance. This was a strange planet to her, after all, while everyone around her had grown up here, so in comparison she worked off very limited information. The smug expression on the commander's face fell away almost instantly, and her poking finger turned into a reassuring palm placed firmly onto Sheeta's shoulder.
"Of course he is,"
she said confidently, and smiled genuinely at Sheeta.
"It's probably just his arm again or something. He'll catch up in a minute, you'll see."
Sheeta nodded and tried to give a reassured expression. However, her meek smile may have fallen a bit short of that. Still, the two women arrived with the rest of their group minus James, who had found a place sitting down in some of the seats in a large row of welded-together chairs. That was part of a formation of many such rows, forming a dark square of seating space clumsily placed inside a corner that was formed by seemingly randomly placed short walls that cut the area off from the rest of the mostly open room with the enormously high ceilings. A good number of the seats were empty, but just as many appeared to be in use, occupied by humans that were either sitting alone or in groups, and appeared to have lost any care about their public appearance at some point, which was a far cry from how Sheeta was used to humans conducting themselves. At first, she assumed that at least some of them must have been homeless and merely used this public and heated place as a way to escape from the cold, as well as have a semi-comfortable place to sleep. The mismatched mix of clothes they wore, and the way they simply lie down across multiple of the seats to sleep out in the open, and surrounded by people like this, certainly indicated as much. However, the fact that most, if not all of them, appeared to have a well-groomed appearance, as well as finely maintained luggage with them, soon made her doubt that theory. And then she fully disregarded it, when she saw that even Nia had now fully removed her shoes and sat sideways in her seat, leaning her back against Tuya, while putting her feet up onto the empty seat next to her. The two then glanced up at the new arrivals, as Coco announced them with a loud "Yoo-hoo!" and a wave. "I've gone ahead and put the car for us already," Nia informed them, not bothering with greeting the people she had literally just seen minutes ago again. "Let's hope James is not going to take all day." Tuya chuckled. "Well, I'm sure if it was up to him, he wouldn't." she jested, before glancing up at Sheeda specifically. "Heard anything from him?" Sheeda shook her head. However, the casual way they talked about the event did somewhat ease her mind a little more. At least it seemed that no one else was really worried about it. "Nothing yet," she said, with her mood slightly lightening. "Well, don't you worry," Coco announced, and slung her arm around Sheeda's back to pull her in closer. The very casual relationship that the commander seemed to have with personal contact had at this point already become familiar to her. "We'll keep you good company until Jamie's back." "I'm sure you will," Nia mumbled under her breath to that, causing Tuyo to chuckle slightly. It took maybe 20 or 30 more minutes of waiting and casual conversation before the near-complete black and white silhouette of James finally emerged from the constant stream of people traversing the port. Immediately, Sheeda jumped up to greet him, and he happily met her with a one-armed hug, although a quick groaning sigh told of some strained nerves on his part. "What did they want from you?" Nia asked, swinging her legs around to put her shoes back on, while James was still busy rubbing his forehead against Sheeda's. James cleared his throat for a moment, seemingly trying to keep his voice cordial instead of annoyed as he answered. "Well, at first they wanted to check out the arm," he said, a bit of exasperation still leaking into his voice despite his apparent efforts. "And then I was recognized." Tuya scoffed. "What? Did they want autographs?" she mockingly asked, and folded her arms atop her knees as she leaned forward to look at him with a bit of scrutiny. James rolled his eyes, although at least he seemed slightly amused by her manner of questioning. "Not exactly, no," he replied. "Just some thoughts and well wishes they needed to get out. I don't know if I seemed like I needed it or something, but they were quite enthusiastic about voicing their support." Sheeda furrowed her brow. "And they stopped you for that?" she asked, with slight skepticism in her voice. That sounded highly unprofessional for a place like this, especially if these people were on the clock. James exhaled awkwardly. "I didn't want to just blow them off," he seemingly defended himself, apparently somehow interpreting that comment as being directed against him. "I mean, these are uncertain times for all. Might be good for them to see that I'm just some guy as well." He ran a hand through his black hair, sheepishly wiping some overgrown strands out of his face. "How's it feel, being famous all of a sudden?" Coco then inquired with a curious tilt of her head. James exhaled slowly, stating, "Honestly, I could do without it." Not long after, they crossed the rest of the large halls of the port that mostly consisted of incredibly high, white walls that ended in a glass ceiling. Humans overall appeared to have a thing for glass ceilings, Sheeda noted. Not that that was unique to them in any way, many species did. However, it was a noticeable trend. But while said trend usually served to be able to see the sky at all times, even while indoors, that effect was sadly not achieved today, because said glass ceiling was covered by a thick layer of something. In fact, Sheeda had at first not noticed that it was a glass ceiling at all, until a piece of the thick cover had suddenly slipped off a slanted portion of it right above them, revealing a bit of bright grey sky behind it for a second, before additional material from further up the roof rolled down and covered it once again, though this time thin enough that some light could still shine through. Of course, the place was just as crowded as every human-populated area appeared to be, and so it took them a bit to traverse the sea of people on their way out. However, Sheeda did notice that, when comparing it to the crew of the ships or the people of Mars she had seen so far, the variety of humans around here appeared to be a bit lessened in comparison, as most humans around appeared to be of James's and Coco's pale variety. Others were still around, of course, however in much lesser numbers, meaning that Nia's dark skin and Tuya's more narrow features made them stick out from the mass quite a bit more here than they had done out in space. Every now and then, some of the other humans' eyes seemed to subconsciously stick to them for just a second longer than they did to other people. Then again, that was still nothing against the number of outright stares that Sheeda got from all around them, given that her ears and tail stuck out of her thick outfit and her face was, upon closer inspection, very different from that of a human. But she had expected nothing else, and had also been used to stares for all of her life, so it bothered her little overall. This variety of appreciated novelty stare was still preferable to unwanted intruder. Some humans even seemed like they wanted to stop and talk to her. However, luckily, they seemed to decide against it quite quickly. She remembered her first few weeks of living among humans on board of the Salem, and she was quite happy that that same state of affairs would hopefully not be repeating itself here. Finally, they arrived at the exit. James, Coco, and Tuya immediately made motions to step right out. However, Nia quickly stopped them and grabbed Sheeta by the wrist to step aside for a second, so they could wrap themselves up a bit more. Gloves, hats, and scarves had so far not really been necessary in the heated building, but now that they were to step outside, it was time to suit up. Nia herself quickly put on all her accessories within a few seconds of time, and then briefly got treated to seeing Sheeta struggle with one of the scarves she had brought, before stepping in with a chuckle. "If you wanted to hold," she said, and gently swept Sheeta's hands aside to take hold of the two ends of the knitted fabric herself, "you should wrap it like this." She then put the ends of the scarf together, making it into a loop, before snugly wrapping it around Sheeta's neck and pulling it closed, by bringing the ends through said loop and pulling. Then, in a joking fashion, she briefly pulled the scarf up a bit, covering the lower half of Sheeta's face. "You can also hide inside it if it gets too cold," she said with a smile while stepping back, leaving Sheeta to pull the thing down again, as it began to tickle her nose with its roughish surface. Still, she nodded at the woman understandingly. Together they then rejoined the group, and for a moment the discrepancy in clothing was almost comical. Tuya and Coco were at least still comparable, having put on their thick jackets and gloves, but forgoing scarves or hats for the time being. James, on the other hand, was wearing a jacket that was barely any thicker than how he usually dressed, and his hands, face, and neck were all completely uncovered. Weak, he almost immediately scrutinized his sister, which she apparently didn't even dignify with a rebuttal, as she rejoined with Tuya on the way out. Coco quickly followed after, leaving James and Sheeta to be the last to step outside. "Ready to see one of our Deathworld features?" he asked facetiously, before offering her his arm so she could snuggle up to him. It was, of course, ineffective with all the layers of clothes in between them, but the gesture was still there. "Honestly, I don't think I could be prepared for this," she honestly replied, as she stared at the glass doors in front of her, outside of which was a bright and monochromous land of nearly pure white. Almost everything was covered in a thick layer of a powdery white material that was only absent wherever masses of walking humans had trampled it over time, or it had seemingly been artificially removed to clear a dark walkway or street for use. Boxy-formed cars with shiny exteriors of all colours were speeding along dark roads just outside, while bundled up humans packed into thick clothes were trudging along the sidewalks. In the distance, she could see the vague outline of more high-stacked buildings towering up high one next to another, and above it all, there was a painfully bright grey sky that was covered over and over in thick clouds, a far cry from the beautiful indigo on Dunama. After a moment of mental preparation, Sheeta then made her first step, which caused James to slowly lead her out. As soon as the door opened, a biting wall of cold air slapped Sheeta right in her face, immediately bringing the feeling of tiny needles poking into her skin with it. So far, she had known this feeling only from sticking her head into freezers, back in the GES. James had been right. This was much colder than the frigid south. Immediately, Sheeta went to follow Nia's advice, and lifted her hand to pull the scarf over her face. However, she stopped short in the motion, as she inadvertently lowered her gaze in the process, with it then landing on a tiny white puff of steam that hovered right in front of her face, as if she had just taken a huff of some recreational smoke. Fascinated, she stared at it for a moment, wondering where it came from, before her question was immediately answered by her next exhale, as her breath carried another cloud right out of her mouth, leaving it to slowly dissipate through the air. Slowly, she began to realize that she had heard of this effect before. Moisture within warm-blooded breath could be made visibly by severely cold temperatures if the conditions were right. However, if she was honest, it hadn't ever occurred to her that she would be seeing it herself. Stuck in fascination, she began blowing out some more little clouds, varying up the force of her exhales to give them different forms and speed. Breathing slowly meant a thick flow of steam emerging and wafting around right in front of her face. breathing quickly sent out a long pillar of undulating smoke that seemed to curl into itself at its end, reminding a bit of a jet stream. She had gotten so distracted by it that she quickly forgot the coldness of her face, as it suddenly got used to the air's temperature. Next to her, James loudly sucked in a deep, sharp breath, before letting it out with a very satisfied groan, his own breath wafting around him in a thick cloud of white. "Ah, that's the stuff," he announced, while briefly shuddering, although it didn't seem to be caused by the cold. She'd turned slightly, surprised by just how loud his voice sounded, despite the fact that he seemed to be putting no more force into it than he usually did. In fact, while concentrating for a second, everything seemed to be a lot louder. The cars on the street, the crunchy steps on the ground, even the conversations of people talking quietly pretty far away from them carried to her ears crisp and clear. Was there something about Earth's atmosphere that made sound travel a lot better? Or was that also something that the cold brought with it? Now there was a question she never thought she'd have to ask herself. Am I hearing better because it's so freaking cold? And while she was on the topic of pondering phenomena she may have heard about at some point, her eyes zeroed in on the stuff littering the ground. It was mostly cleared out here on the sidewalk, but a few steps over from them, a white hill of the stuff was piled on, slightly out of the way. Pulling James along for a few steps, she skulked over towards it, before briefly bending down to pick a handful of it up. Luckily, her gloves protected her from the worst of it. However, even through them, she could still feel that it too was cold. And she probably knew what it was too, even if she had only ever had it described to her, or seen it on vague pictures. Snow. Puffy crystals of frozen water. Another thing that she hadn't exactly figured she would ever encounter in person. While white pus still escaped her mouth with every breath, she closed her hand around it, trying to get a better picture of its consistency. For the most part, it seemed to be rather loose and powdery, easily falling apart if the least bit of force was applied. However, when she closed her hands and compressed it, it quickly stuck together and became a firmer mass as its density increased, although it still remained somewhat malleable and could be pressed into different forms with some effort. When doing so, a bit of water seemed to get pressed out of it, although Sheila wasn't sure if that was the material actually holding on to liquid water somehow, or if the stress of compression caused some of the crystals to melt in the process. "If you throw that at me, we're not friends anymore," Nia suddenly announced from in front of her, while Sheila had absent-mindedly pressed some of the snow into a round ball, or playing around with it. Sheila looked up at her with a bit of confusion. "Why would I?" she began to ask, but then noticed that behind Nia, Coco stood with her hand raised and a very similar ball of snow right in her palm, having seemingly been ready to do exactly that before being stopped by the statement. Now, the commander instead just allowed the formed snow to roll out of her hand, and it fell harmlessly to the ground, where it immediately shattered into some powder, as well as hundreds of crude pieces. "Killjoy," she mumbled under her breath, and stored her hands away in her jacket's pockets before turning away. Sheila was mostly confused, but James and Tuya seemed to find that interaction quite amusing, indicated by their sniggering. "Come on," Nia then continued, and turned to look around at each of them for a moment. "Let's get out of the cold already." With that, she began to stomp along the sidewalk, likely leading them to the rented vehicle she had booked for them. Tuya and Coco exchanged a brief, shrugging look with each other before following her. Meanwhile, James leaned in towards Sheila for a second. "You holding up okay?" he asked earnestly, his own enjoyment of this cold seemingly not getting in the way of his understanding that this might be uncomfortable for her. Well, it had only been a few minutes so far, but she'd already felt some of the surrounding iciness creep across her skin. It wasn't anything she wouldn't be able to bear, as the thick clothes did a good job at least keeping her somewhat comfortable. However, she had to admit, if this went on for much longer, her mood would probably sour at some point. For now, the cold was still novel and therefore somewhat exciting. However, as soon as it became mundane, it would probably turn into annoyance quite soon, and she still much preferred the heat. "I'll live," she therefore replied, while she also began to follow the other women. "But I'm more interested in you showing me how you warm up around here." Luckily, their car wasn't parked too far away from them, standing on a huge open area that was seemingly meant for nothing else than parking cars. After a brief moment of fiddling around with their luggage to fit it all inside, they soon sat in the heated cabin of the vehicle. Sheeta had graciously been offered one of the front seats together with Coco, while James, Nia and Tuya, in that order, squeezed themselves into the back seats quite snugly. Coco quickly spoke up, seemingly giving commands to the vehicle, though in a language that Sheeta didn't understand. The local one, if she had to guess. And automatically the vehicle came to life, pulling out of the parking area and integrating itself into the traffic fully on its own. Automatic driving? Sheeta asked in surprise, and turned to look at James for a moment. Yeah, people tend to suck at driving, James gave back amusedly, while shifting slightly so his legs wouldn't constantly press against Nia during the ride. Once we actually perfected them, computers tended to get into far less accidents. Sheeta shifted to look at the mostly blank dashboard in front of her, the only real feature of which was a computer screen that could likely be used for entertainment or something, but showed no actual data concerning their vehicle. And there's no manual supervision at all, she asked, and leaned over to see if Coco's side of the car had any more to offer. However, it didn't seem like it. Coco in turn scoffed. If you give people an avenue to screw something up, they'll usually find and take it, she explained with a shrug. So we don't even bother. Apparently, humans were a lot less averse to automation than large parts of the rest of the galaxy, which was somewhat strange considering their rather stringent stances on AI. However, there was probably one of those parts of life that they didn't even question at this point, so digging deeper into that would probably be rather fruitless. Instead, Sheeta began to look out the window and watch the white lands outside fly past them as they drove along. She mostly tuned out the ongoing conversations in the car. Instead, she focused on the slowly changing landscapes. At first, this place was quite similar to Mars, apart from the absence of any domes and the masses of snow, of course. Tide living, high buildings, densely packed humans all around. However, after a while, that scene changed as they started to leave the city. This was the interesting part. On Dunima, the cities were mostly just for work and convenience to have everything in one place, but were otherwise avoided, while people lived on their own land in the outskirts, if they could afford it. How would that look here, in a place where most people seemingly lived in the city full time? As they drove out of the city, the car at first pulled onto what seemed to be some form of connecting fast road, made for cars and cars only. High walls on either side of the road took away most of her vision, and thus made this stretch rather uninterestingly, although every now and again there were some gaps that allowed her insight into the surrounding areas. A lot of area seemed to just be wide and open, with an unblemished sheet of perfectly white snow, making the land appear like a blank page for enormous stretches of space. After she was initially confused by that, it soon clicked for Sheeta that humans were omnivorous, and therefore probably had large fields of crops that took up a lot of space. And said crops probably didn't grow with all of this snow around, leaving the fields untouched for the time it was around. Further in the distance, she saw a hint of some hills growing up above the horizon, and seemingly they were all covered in trees. It was amazing to her that any vegetation survived when it literally couldn't get any water because it was all frozen, but then again, this was still a Deathworld. For a second she even wondered if there was such a thing as a warm-blooded plant that could live here, but she quickly disregarded that thought. Either way, the more interesting part of the journey came when they left this fast road and crossed into a more residential area again. That wasn't quite a city. However, it wasn't really anything she had expected either. While the houses here didn't stack up into the sky like the ones in the cities did, they were still just as boxy. Apparently, curves and roundness were rather rarely used in human architecture, although it didn't quite seem like they were unheard of. Also, while these houses did have some room to breathe next to each other, and humans seemed to be living less shoulder on shoulder here, they still stood a lot closer together than what most Miad would have been comfortable with most of them having less than 10 measures in between their walls. And with the way the windows were situated, it was likely that your neighbours would be able to see anything you did on your own property, if they only bothered to glance outside. Then again, compared to what she had seen in the city, even this seemed like a luxury. At least this confirmed her notions that humans were entirely comfortable with living densely packed together, even if they didn't absolutely have to. And it also seemed that few humans had interest in living self-sufficiently, as she'd doubted that most of the tiny gardens she saw around the houses would be anywhere near enough to provide consistently for whoever lived there. She also saw little to no indications of private meat farms, meaning that either these people lived entirely off a herbivorous diet, or any meat they ate was completely brought from outside sources. Not that that was all too strange of a thing, all things considered, but it was certainly different. Seemed like living on your own in any way really wasn't much of a concern for the people here. "Oh, hey, we're almost there," James suddenly announced, as his gaze briefly got stuck to a large blue sign that was mounted above the street and likely gave some sort of direction, even if Sheeta had some trouble reading it. And indeed, shortly after that sign, the car turned into a street that was right next to the tree line of a small forest with greyish-brown trees, which they followed all the way to its end, where they finally stopped in front of a large fenced-in area.
"Man, it's been ages since I was here last time,"
Coco mumbled next to Sheeta, staring at the fence with big eyes, while all of the others already got to pinning themselves out of the back seats. Sheeta also studied the fence for a second, as cold air leaked into the car through the open doors. The fence consisted of thick metal rods that were rooted in the ground and connected with some form of tight chain link, on top of which a strange saw-like line of thin metal was stretched along its length. Every 50 or so measures, signs were attached to the chain link. Warnings about the dangers lurking behind were spelled out upon them in 3 languages, 2 of which Sheeta could read. Lethal animals, high voltage, armed personnel, and trained guard dogs were only some of the warnings that were offered to people who sought to unlawfully cross this barrier, each of which was also supported by a tiny vague picture that depicted the forms of danger that would be faced on the inside, trying to make it understandable even to those who could not decipher the meaning of the words themselves. Not far from their car, the fence was interrupted by a single time by a small building it directly connected to. Krieger's Wildlife Sanctuary and Domestable Rehabilitation was spelled out in custom, cut-out letters that were attached to the roof by a metal framework, thankfully written in English so Sheeta could understand it, although she had no idea what a domestable was supposed to be. The building itself was rather plain in comparison, consisting of blank walls that were only broken up by simple doors and windows, next to one of which was some form of metal hatch as well. Although, a bit of decoration has snuck in there in form of some colourful bows or ribbons that were stuck to the windows from the inside, giving it a somewhat festive look. Finally, Sheeta also stepped out of the car, quickly moving around to get her luggage, while the cold once again bit at her face. The ground here had not been fully cleared of snow, and so the frozen crystals heavily crunched onto her soles and made her steps uneven, as she was forced to drag her feet through the thick layer of it while walking. At least this was the first place that didn't seem packed to the brim. In fact, not a soul but them seemed to be around, which was almost eerie after all the bustle around them almost the entire way here. "Welcome to the compound, situated in scenic nowhere, North Rhine-Westphalia," Nia announced to those who had never been here, with a wide arch of her arms. "Do try to contain your excitement, though. It stresses the animals." Although that last part was clearly meant to be a joke, it seemed that at least Coco and James were indeed very excited to come back to this place. And Tuya at least seemed to be somewhat interested, given the seemingly quite secure fence around the place. Sheeta was unsure so far. Animals had been a vague, distinct fascination for her at most, but were usually a non-factor in her life. "So, what kind of stuff do you have in there?" Tuya, on the other hand, asked curiously, while glancing through the chain link, probably to see if she couldn't sneak a look at some of the animals, waiting for them on the inside. Nia sighed. "All kinds of stuff, really. Always depends on what came in recently, although they also have some permanent guests, of course," she explained with slightly hanging shoulders. "It'll be much easier to just show you, trust me." While James agreed to that with a nod, Nia started to take the lead. She easily unlocked the closed entrance with a press of her briefly ungloved finger onto one of the biometric scanners at the door, and then quickly hurried inside, holding the door open for the next person in line. One after another, they all stepped inside, until James finally allowed the door to fall shut behind them. The room itself wasn't much to talk about. It appeared to mostly be a sort of welcoming area, with doors leading away to what seemed to be a tiny office, as well as some storage area for cleaning supplies. Integrated into the walls were what appeared to be large illuminated glass boxes, filled with soil and plants. A strange form of decoration, She'd thought, although Coco and Tuya seemed to excitedly hurry over to some of them, eagerly peeking inside. Was there something interesting to see there? Not here, Nia mumbled, as she had quickly checked inside of the office if anyone was working at the moment. Guess we can walk right through to the house. We can make a proper tour once we got rid of the luggage. She waved everyone along towards the second pair of doors leading back outside, but on the inside of the fence, and she was about to follow her, when she suddenly noticed that James had frozen in place. The look on his face had turned to a sort of confused concern as he stared at the area right next to the door. Underneath what had to be the other side of the metal hatch they had seen from the outside, a tiny mountain of stacked up boxes, packages and paper sacks were piled up, filling a not insubstantial amount of the room's space. After a few more moments of staring, James walked over and inspected the items, some of which had paper slips with some writing attached to them. Upon closer inspection, it was also obvious that a good number of the boxes and packages had been opened at some point, with some of the contents being removed while leaving the rest behind with the broken packaging. At a glance, Sheeta could see what looked like packages of some form of seeds or nuts, colourful constructions made of rope and wood, large paper bags with pictures of some sort of animals printed onto the front, a number of finely stitched plush toys, towers of tin cans, and multiple large hay bales. Meanwhile, James had knelt down in front of the piles and was concentratedly reading some of the attached slips, while quietly mumbling, August, September, August, December, July. He stopped and let his hands sink down, while looking across the pile with even more concern creeping over his face. From the door, Nia had turned around, presumably to see what was holding them up. But now seeing that it was her brother, her face also turned to worry. Everything all right? She asked, and fully stepped inside again. These donations have been lying here for months, James explained, and gestured towards the pile with his mechanical hand. I don't get it. Why would... He stopped in the middle of his sentence, as his eyes apparently caught something else. With quick steps he crossed the room, and stopped at a small stool standing close to the exit. On top of it, there stood a tiny plastic tree that had some red and blue orbs glued into the needle-like leaves. His expression darkening ever more, James picked it up for a moment, looking it all over before putting it back down, his gaze turning to the ribbons attached to the window. For a second he seemed to become genuinely fearful as he nearly ran over to one of the glass boxes, almost pressing his face against its side as he peered inside. However, after a few moments of apparently not finding what he had been afraid of, he breathed up somewhat relieved. In the meantime, Nia had also checked the pile of boxes for a second. Maybe he just didn't get to it yet, she mumbled, although she didn't sound especially convinced of her own words. Not able to keep it in anymore, Sheeta walked over to James and reassuringly grabbed onto his arm. Is everything all right? She asked, and forced him to look at her face for a moment by turning his head with her hand on his cheek. James exhaled deeply, and simply thought about that for a second. Yeah, I think so, he mumbled and smiled at her, although it looked somewhat tired after his earlier worry. I just need to check on something while we're here. He wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her in to press a kiss onto her forehead, before nodding at Nia to indicate that he would be ready to go now. Nia nodded back at him, and together they moved towards the exit.